Hundreds of men drowned at Agincourt, on a battlefield with no river, no lake, no standing water at all. It was a plowed wheat field between two woods in northern France on the morning of October 25, 1415. French knights in steel plate walked toward the English line, and the ground began to swallow them. A man who fell face first didn't get up. The men behind him didn't stop, couldn't stop, and walked over his back. And when the fighting ended, an English priest who'd watched the whole thing from behind the lines recorded a detail stranger than the battle itself. The French dead lay stacked in heaps higher than a standing man. And many of the men inside those heaps had never been touched by an English weapon. None of that should be possible. These were the most protected soldiers who had ever walked onto a battlefield. Grown men encased in articulated steel, trained for war from childhood. We assume battles kill with weapons, arrows, blades, hooves. The record from that morning says otherwise. Chroniclers on both sides describe men suffocating in mud they could have crawled out of on any other day, smothered under the living as much as the dead, drowning inside their own sealed helmets. And the force that did it isn't medieval. It still kills people today. Stadiums in festival crowds, in packed streets. And if you've ever stood in a crowd that suddenly stopped moving, you felt its first warning sign. The men who died at Agincourt met that force with no name for it, no science for it, and no way out of it. It would take 500 years to understand what actually happened on that field. The English army on that field was, by any sane measure, already beaten. Henry V had invaded Normandy in August. By late October, a brutal siege and an epidemic of dysentery had carved his army down to somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 men, most of them archers, not knights. Marching hungry and sick for the safety of English-held Calais. The French intercepted them near the village of Agincourt and blocked the road north. Modern historians still argue about the numbers, but most estimates put the French force at 12,000 to 15,000, rested, fed, and crowded with the armored nobility of France. The French didn't just expect to win, they expected a harvest of noble prisoners and ransoms. What they got instead began with the weather. It rained all night. The two armies camped close enough to hear each other's horses while a steady autumn downpour soaked a field that had just been plowed for the winter's sowing heavy clay soil, the kind that holds water at the surface and churns into paste. And the field had a shape that mattered more than anyone yet understood. Dense woodland hemmed it in on both sides. The woods of Agincourt on one flank, Tramcourt on the other, squeezing the open ground into a corridor that narrowed toward the English position. 15,000 men would have to attack down a funnel. To the French commanders, the narrow frontage looked like a nuisance. To the men who would stand in the front rank, it was about to become the walls of a press. The story usually reaches here for its favorite villain, the armor. The image everyone carries is the knight as a helpless turtle. A man so buried in metal that falling over meant lying there like a flipped beetle. That image is mostly wrong. A 15th century suit of field armor weighed 30 to 50 kilograms, but the weight was spread across the whole body and articulated at every joint, and men who trained in it from boyhood could run, climb, and mount a horse unaided. The soldiers who advanced across that field weren't clumsy statues. They were elite, conditioned fighters in the best protective equipment in Europe. Which sharpens the question instead of answering it, how do men like that end up drowning in farmland? The answer starts with what a few hundred yards of mud took out of them, because 6 centuries later, someone measured it. A monk at the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, compiling the official French chronicle of the reign, recorded what the advance actually looked like from his own kingdom's side. The men-at-arms marched through mud into which they sank up to their knees, and were already overcome with fatigue even before they advanced against the enemy, knee-deep. Every stride meant tearing a steel-shod leg out of suction over and over across a few hundred yards of ground that thousands of feet and hooves were churning deeper with every passing minute. The first French line didn't crash into the English, By the time it arrived, it could barely walk. In 2011, a team of physiologists led by Graham Askew at the University of Leeds decided to measure what movement in armor actually costs. They put fight interpreters from the Royal Armoury's men who wear replica medieval plate for a living on treadmills in full 15th century harness, breathing into respirometry masks. The results, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, were blunt. Walking in armor burned roughly 2.1 to 2.3 times the energy of walking unloaded, and running nearly twice as much. Worse, because plate loads the limbs rather than the torso, every single stride swings steel. A burden a backpack of equal weight doesn't impose. And the breastplate did something more insidious. It constricted the chest and forced shallower, faster breathing. That was the cost on a dry laboratory treadmill. Now put that body in knee-deep clay. They made that walk with their faces sealed shut. The English arrow storm forced every man to lower his visor and bow his head, taking the steel of his helmet rather than the slits of his eyes toward the sky. So picture the French advance, honestly hearts hammering at their limit, lungs pinned behind a breastplate, air pulled through a slot the width of a finger, vision reduced to a strip of churned earth. The armor kept nearly every arrow out. It also sealed each man inside a private airless box at the exact moment his body was screaming for oxygen. Then the front rank finally reached the English line, and the thousands behind it kept coming. The chaplain traveling with the English baggage, the anonymous author of the Gesta Hen Re Qui Quinti, the only surviving account written by an eyewitness, describes what happened next in language that still reads like disbelief. The living, he wrote, fell on top of the dead, and others fell on top of the living and were killed where they lay. Until at the three places where the English standard stood, the heaps of bodies grew higher than a man's height, and English soldiers climbed the piles of their enemies to keep fighting, striking down at the men beneath them. From the French side, the chronicler En Guerre en deux Monstres added the detail that explains everything. The men-at-arms were packed together so tightly that many could not raise their arms to strike. An army of thousands had compressed itself until it could no longer fight at all. What the chronicles were describing, without any vocabulary to name it, is what safety engineers now call a crowd crush. Modern crowd science has measured the thresholds. At densities around 6 people per square meter, a crowd stops behaving like a collection of individuals and starts behaving like a fluid force applied at the back travels through bodies in waves that no one in the middle can resist. Past 8, engineers speak of progressive crowd collapse. One person goes down, the bodies around them lose support and fold into the gap, and the pressure of everyone behind rolls over the top. People in a crush die standing up, unwounded. From compressive asphyxia, the squeeze of the surrounding bodies simply will not let the ribcage expand. No blade required. No water either. Now go back to that first night, face down in the mud. His visor slits are pressed into liquid clay. His arms can't find purchase in the slurry. And the treadmills at Leeds explain why his exhausted body has almost nothing left to push with. On his back lies the weight of the next man who fell, and on that man another. The historian Juliet Barker, in her account of the battle, notes that some men in exactly that position drowned inside their own helmets. Agincourt had assembled every ingredient of a modern crowd disaster on one medieval field, a tapering funnel. A mass of thousands pressing towards something they couldn't see, and a front rank with nowhere left to go. The French army's great advantage that morning was supposed to be its size. Its size is what killed it. That's the detail worth sitting with, because it means most of the men doing the killing never knew they were doing it. A knight in the 3rd French line, shoving forward through the mud toward the noise of battle, was doing exactly what courage and duty demanded, and every step he took traveled through the packed bodies ahead of him and pressed a countryman's face deeper into the clay. The crowd transmitted his bravery forward as force. In a crush, there is no villain to point to. The weapon is the mass itself, and every man inside it is both wielding it and dying by it. This had happened before, and the men of 1415 could have read about it. 83 years earlier, at Duplin Moor in Scotland, a Scottish army several times the size of its enemy pressed itself into a narrow valley against a thin English line, the rear rank shoving the front forward into the arrows, with nowhere to spread out. The Lanner cost Chronicle records that the pile of dead stood taller than one whole spear's length. And the chroniclers agreed that more Scots died by suffocation, crushed and trampled under their own comrades, than by any English weapon. The chronicler John Capgrave compressed it into a single terrible line, rushing forward on each other. The whole army became a heap of the slain. There was no all-night rain at Duplin Moor, no sea of mud. Agincourt's mud was an accelerant. The crowd was the fire, and the press didn't check which side a man was on. The most senior Englishman to die at Agincourt was Edward, Duke of York, cousin to the king, commanding the right of Henry's line, and no one is entirely sure what killed him. One London chronicle describes him fighting at his standard until his helmet was beaten into his skull. But other accounts, written within a generation, say he died of much heat and pressing, smothered without a fatal wound in the same crush that was consuming the French a sword's length away. The famous story that he was simply too fat to survive the melee was invented more than a century later by a Tudor writer. The Duke's own household accounts, rediscovered recently, show a lean, disciplined man who lived for the hunt. Even on the winning side, in the winning hour, a body could be standing in the wrong place when the human wave broke. Read with modern eyes, Agincourt looks less like a triumph of the longbow than a mass casualty crowd disaster that happened to have a battle attached. Around 6,000 Frenchmen died in a matter of hours. English losses, by various counts, ran from about 100 to a few hundred. For 6 centuries, that impossible arithmetic has been credited to the English archers, and the archers were lethal. But even the English eyewitness doesn't describe an army shot down at a distance. He describes heaps and pressing and men killed by the living falling onto them. The deadliest force on the field was geometry, a funnel of woodland, a soft floor, and 15,000 determined men converting themselves step by step into a fluid. Medieval commanders understood weapons, walls, and horses. No one on earth yet understood what a crowd becomes past a certain density. We understand it now, because we kept paying to learn it. The science of crowd dynamics was written in the aftermath of modern disasters, at football stadiums and festivals and pilgrimages, and it rediscovered everything the field at Agincourt could have taught: the density thresholds, the pressure waves, the progressive collapse, the people who die on their feet. The next time you see steel barriers dividing a concert floor into pens, or a stadium concourse built with more exits than seems necessary, you are looking at the countermeasure to the force that annihilated the nobility of France. Same species, same physics, 600 years apart. So the question of how knights drowned on dry land has an answer the chroniclers circled, but could never quite land. The French army was defeated by the French army. The English fought superbly, and the mud was merciless. But the force that stacked the dead higher than a man's height was supplied by the victims themselves, delivered through their own courage, their own discipline, their own refusal to stop pressing toward the enemy. An army is a weapon pointed at the enemy. At Agincourt, for a few catastrophic hours, it became a weapon pointed at itself. And it leaves a question historians are still quietly re-examining: how many other famous victories, in how many other centuries, were really crowd disasters wearing a flag. If you enjoy finding the strange physics buried inside history's most familiar stories, consider subscribing. Here is more of the past that doesn't work the way we were told. Thanks for watching.